The wagon brought her west from Moose Jaw on a Tuesday, when the sky over the Saskatchewan prairie had gone the color of pewter and the grass along the road was the pale, exhausted gold of a season already letting go. She sat beside the driver, a man named Stowe, who ran the freight line between town and the outlying farms, and held a canvas bag in her lap and said nothing, and watched the land open in every direction until there was nothing to see but grass and sky and the occasional stand of willows along a low creek bed, bare-branched and waiting for something. She had a letter in her coat pocket. She did not take it out. She had read it often enough that the paper had gone soft at the folds, and the words had arranged themselves into something she could recall without looking. Single man, wheat farm, north of Clearwater, 2 rooms, wages paid monthly, room and board included, no other expectations. The letter had been plain. She had believed it because there had been nothing in it to believe or disbelieve, only facts set out without ornament. A man who needed help and was willing to pay for it. She could cook, and she could clean, and she could manage a household, and she had done all 3 her whole life without wages, and now she was going to do them for wages, and that was all there was to it. Stowe said, "Farm's about 3 miles past the creek crossing. You'll see the windmill first." She said, "Thank you." That was the whole of their conversation. The windmill appeared above the line of the land before she saw the buildings, then a roof, then a second roof and the corner of a barn, the wood weathered silver by seasons of wind. The yard between the house and the barn was open dirt, hardened now with the first cold of October. A water trough near the barn door, a pile of split wood stacked against the south wall of the house, with the precision of someone who had learned not to leave that kind of thing to chance. Everything placed where it needed to be, nothing extra. Stowe stopped the wagon in the yard. She climbed down before he could offer to help, which was not rudeness, only habit. She was standing with her bag at her feet when the barn door opened. The man who came toward her was older than she had imagined from the letter. Not old, but worn in the particular way that belongs to men who have spent years in weather. He wore a canvas coat, the color of dry soil, and he walked without hurry, and stopped a few feet from where she stood, and looked at her the same way he might look at a sky that was still deciding what it intended to do. He said, "You're from the agency in Moose Jaw." She said, "I am." He nodded once, as if that settled something. He looked at the canvas bag. She watched his eyes take the measure of it without comment. One bag, October, a woman who had come a long way with very little, and then he turned toward the house. "I'll show you the room," he said. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. The house was 2 rooms and a lean-to off the kitchen where the tools were kept. The front room had a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that threw heat unevenly to the left, and a shelf with a tin coffee pot and 3 cups arranged without thought for appearance, but with a kind of implicit order. The second room was hers, small, with a single window that looked north over a 1/4 mile of stubble field, a pallet with a wool blanket folded at the foot of it, and a nail on the wall above the door. She set her bag on the pallet and looked at the window. He said, from the doorway, "Stove in the front room's faster to heat in the mornings. The flue pulls right if you crack the damper first." She said, "I'll remember that." He left. She heard his boots cross the front room and the door close behind him, and then the muffled sound of the barn, something that might have been a horse moving in its stall. She unpacked her bag. There was not much in it. She hung her second dress on the nail above the door and put her shoes under the pallet and sat for a moment on the edge of it with her hands open in her lap. The room smelled of dry wood and old grass and cold. Through the wall, she could hear the wind working its way across the field. In the far corner of the room, near the floor, someone had filled a gap in the baseboards with a strip of burlap cloth. Careful work, the kind you do when you know winter is going to find every space you leave it. She did not know what kind of man packed a gap in a baseboard with burlap, but she thought it was a careful kind. She thought she could work in a house kept by a careful kind of man. He had left food on the table. She did not know when. Bread, a round of hard cheese, a pot of something that had been kept warm on the stove's back plate. Soup, she would learn. Later he made it on Sundays and heated it through the week. She ate standing at the counter without lighting a second lamp. because one lamp was enough when you were eating alone, and she had eaten alone for long enough that it required no adjustment. She washed her dish and set it on the shelf, and did not look at the chair across the table because it was not her chair to look at. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of arrangement this was. The arrangement, she learned over the following days, was a quiet one. He rose before she did and was at the barn by the time she came down to light the stove. She left coffee on the back plate for when he came in. He drank it, standing at the counter, 2 cups, fast, the way a man drinks who has work that is already waiting for him. Then he went back out. She did not follow him into the yard, and he did not linger in the kitchen, and the hours between breakfast and the middle of the day were hers to manage as she thought best. She managed them. She found where things were kept and reorganized nothing, only cleaned what had gone dusty and mended the things she found in the basket by the door. A wool shirt with the collar separating at the seam, 2 pairs of heavy socks, a pair of canvas trousers with the right knee worn through. She did not ask who the clothes belonged to. They were in the mending basket. That was reason enough. On the 3rd day, she found the shawl. It was on a hook behind the back door, the one that led to the lean-to. Gray wool, the color of old cloud, worn through at both elbows to the warp threads beneath. Whoever had worn it had been smaller than her by a full measure through the shoulders. It had been there long enough that the hook had left an oval rust stain at the back of the collar where the metal touched the wet wool after rain. No one had moved it in a long time. No one had thrown it away. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the lean-to for the kindling she had come for and did not look at it again. She would not touch it. That was not her call to make. In the 2nd week, he came in from the barn at mid-morning and found her at the table with the sleeves of his canvas coat turned out and a length of new thread on the bobbin of her needle. He stopped in the doorway. She said, without looking up. The right sleeve was pulling at the lining. I found thread in the tin on the shelf. Similar weight, close enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the counter and poured his coffee and sat down in the opposite chair, which was the first time he had sat at the table while she was working at it. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked at the coat and not at her. He said, "My wife kept the sewing things in that tin." She did not stop sewing, she said. It was a good place to keep them. He said nothing else. After a time, he finished his coffee and went back out. She completed the sleeve and folded the coat over the arm of the chair and moved to start the noon meal. She had not looked at his face when he said it. She had not wanted to see what was in it because it was not hers to see, not yet. But she had heard the way he said "my wife," the same way a person says the name of a place they have left and do not expect to return to. Factual and far away and accurate in the way that only things that hurt can be accurate. His wife had been dead 3 years. She did not know this for certain. She inferred it from the shawl and from the single coffee cup on the shelf that was older than the others, and from the way the house had the particular tidiness of a man who had organized his grief into the corners and kept the middle of the room clear. They went to the general store on a Friday in the 3rd week. He had said the night before without preamble, "Supplies tomorrow morning if you have a list." She did. She had been keeping it on the back of an envelope from the drawer in the kitchen. A drawer she had opened carefully and closed carefully because it was not her drawer. The store in Clearwater was smaller than she expected and run by a man named Peavy, who was old and slow and watchful in the way of men who have stood behind a counter long enough to have seen most things. He nodded when they came in and began pulling items from the shelf before they had finished reading from the list, which told her he knew the farm's regular order by heart. She moved along the far wall while the man spoke with Peavy. She was not listening. She ran her fingers along a row of tins, examined a spool of linen thread, set it back. She found herself, without quite intending to, standing in front of a small wooden box at the end of the shelf. The box held seed packets. Late season discounted, the paper hand-printed over with half prices in red ink. Vegetable seeds, flower seeds, the kind of things you ordered in October if you were already planning for spring. She picked up a packet near the back. Prairie crocus. The illustration showed a pale violet flower with a yellow center, low to the ground, the kind that came up before the snow had fully retreated, the first thing to bloom in a prairie spring. She had not seen them in years. She held the packet for a moment, then she set it back. Spring was a long way off. She had no claim on spring here, no reason to be planting gardens when she did not know where she would be in April. It was not practical. She returned it to the box and went to find the thread she actually needed. She had not looked toward the counter when she set it down. She had not looked at him. They walked back from the store along the main street of Clearwater with the wrapped parcels distributed between them. The air had sharpened since morning, the kind of cold that arrived on the prairies not as a sharp edge but as a weight, something settling over everything from above. A woman came out of the post office as they passed it. She was perhaps 60, with a gray hat pinned at a precise angle, and the expression of a woman who had appointed herself the custodian of a great deal of information she had not been asked to keep. She stopped on the step. She said, "I see you've brought your girl in from out of town." She said it to him, but she was looking at the woman beside him with the kind of careful inspection that is meant to be seen. The man said, "She keeps the house." The woman in the gray hat allowed a small, deliberate pause. "Of course," she said. "And you've settled the arrangements properly, I imagine. It can be complicated, a young woman in a house with a man on his own. People do wonder." The woman with the parcels said, "The wages are paid monthly and the room is separate. It's a straightforward arrangement." She said it the same way she would have stated the price of flour. Not cold, not warm, a fact. The woman in the gray hat looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Then she nodded once and went on her way. They walked the rest of the block without speaking. She expected him to say something, to acknowledge the small, unpleasant event that had just occurred. He did not. He held his side of the parcels and kept walking. She decided she did not mind. She had said what needed to be said. He had heard it. That was enough. But at the corner, before they turned toward where the wagon was hitched, he stopped. She stopped beside him. He was looking down the street in the direction the woman had gone, and the line of his jaw had the quality of a man who has been considering something longer than this morning. He said, "Her husband used to drink." She redirected herself. The woman did not know what to say to that. She looked at the side of his face. He turned and walked toward the wagon. After a moment, she followed. She thought about it on the drive back, the parcels shifting in her lap on the rutted road, the prairie going wide and cold on either side. It was not an apology for the woman in the gray hat. It was not a defense of her, either. It was something more like what a man does when he wants you to know that he has seen what happened, and that his silence was not indifference. It was the only language he had for it, and he had used it. She looked at the road ahead and said nothing, and found that was sufficient. October passed. She counted it in the changes. The stubble field going silver under the first frost. The mornings requiring 2 layers before she could light the stove without her fingers going stiff. The hour of full light growing shorter by degrees until she was doing the supper dishes in the dark. She had settled into the rhythms of the house. She knew which floorboard woke the room when she stepped on it in the night. She knew the stove draft took 3 minutes to draw properly if the wind was from the north, 2 if it was from the west. She knew that he drank his first coffee in silence, and his second with whatever was on his mind, which was rarely much but occasionally a single sentence that opened a subject, and then closed it again before she could fully respond. Not rudeness, just the economy of a man who had been alone long enough to have edited himself down to the essential. The shawl was still on the hook. She had stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing something that has become part of the house itself, like a worn spot on a step or the sound a window makes when the temperature drops. It was there. It was not hers to move. One evening she came back from the lean-to with an armful of wood, and the shawl had slipped from the hook, half off, dragging on the floor. She set the wood down. She picked it up. She replaced it on the hook. She smoothed it once across the shoulders with the flat of her hand, the way you straighten something that belongs in a place and has simply fallen out of it. Then she picked up the wood and went to the stove. She did not know if he had seen. She thought, from the quality of the silence in the room, that he had. Neither of them said anything about it. She had the feeling afterward that something had shifted without either of them marking the moment it changed. Not the shawl itself. Something larger and quieter, the way the pressure in a room shifts when a door is closed somewhere in the house and the air settles into a new arrangement. The snow came in the second week of November, not gradually. It arrived overnight while the wind was quiet, and in the morning the world outside the north window was transformed, the stubble field smoothed to a white that had no detail in it. The yard between house and barn, a clean surface broken only by his tracks going and coming from the early morning chores. She dressed and came down, and the stove was already lit. The coffee was made. He was at the barn. She poured a cup and stood at the window and looked at his tracks in the snow. They went straight from the house to the barn in a line that had been walked so many times it held its direction without thought. And they came back the same way, and then went again and came back. The same path, worn into the yard through every season until even the first snow knew where to expect it. She thought about what she had come here with. A letter written plainly by a man she had never met, a canvas bag, and a willingness to be useful in a place where no one knew her. She had wanted it to be a transaction, clean, bounded, a thing with an edge you could find, so that when you needed to leave you would know where the edge was. She was not certain anymore where the edge was. He came in from the barn when the light had gone pale and flat over the yard. He knocked the snow from his boots at the door and came inside and poured his coffee and stood at the counter. After a time, he said, "First snow usually holds. We'll lose the road to Clearwater for a week, maybe more." She said, "I know." He said, "You've enough of what you need." She said, "Yes." That was all. She heard him move to the table and sit down. The familiar sounds, the chair, the cup, the particular way he settled both elbows on the surface. She had not been watching him for weeks. She had simply been in the same rooms, and he had simply been there too, and she had learned him the way you learn a house. Not by studying it, but by living in it until it stops being strange. She turned from the window, finally, and went to start the morning meal. She noticed the windowsill as she passed it. She stopped. On the narrow ledge of wood where she kept the measuring tin and a small cloth for wiping the glass, there was a paper packet, small, rectangular, the kind of paper that had been printed by hand and marked down in red ink. Prairie crocus. She picked it up. The illustration showed the pale violet flower, low to the ground, the first thing up in a prairie spring. The paper was slightly soft from the cold of the sill, but intact. The seeds rattled when she tilted it. She stood there with the packet in both hands. He had been on the other side of the counter when she set it back. He had been speaking with Peavy, or she had thought he had been. She had not looked at him when she put it down. She had been certain no one had seen. She had held it for perhaps 5 seconds. She had not said a word about it. She had put it back because it was not practical and because spring was months away and she had no claim on it. She had been sure the gesture was invisible. She set the packet back on the sill. Her hands were not entirely steady. She stood there a moment with her back to the room and looked at it against the pale light of the window, and the snow outside continued covering the field in the patient, unhurried way it would cover everything from now until March. She heard him turn a page of the almanac behind her. She thought. He noticed. Not the packet, not the price printed in red, not the picture of the flower. He had noticed the 5 seconds. He had noticed her pick it up and set it down and say nothing, because there was nothing practical to say, because spring was far away and she had made no claim on it. He had noticed all of that without appearing to notice any of it. And then he had gone back to the counter and done what he knew how to do with a thing he had seen in silence. She did not know what to do with her hands. She reached for the stove damper and opened it and fed the kindling in without thinking. The fire caught on the second try. Outside, the wind had begun to move again, low across the fields, pushing at the walls of the house from every direction. She knew the sound the roof made in this wind. She had learned it the same way she had learned the floorboard, the stove, the quality of light in the north room at different hours. She had learned this house the way you learn a language. not all at once, but in small accumulations, until the day you realize you have stopped translating. She put the kettle on. She did not look at the packet on the sill again, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has shifted in a room without moving. The whole balance changed by a small thing in a place it had not been before. He turned another page of the almanac. The stove ticked with the growing heat. Later, in the spring, she would plant them along the south side of the house, where the snow retreated first and the light came earliest in the day. She did not know this yet. She knew only the packet on the sill and the snow coming down, and the sound of the almanac pages turning in the room behind her. And the fact that she had stopped counting the days the way she had counted them when she first arrived, measuring the arrangement, checking for the edge, making sure she knew where it was. She had stopped looking for it. She was already here,